During the secretary's first day at work, the millionaire froze when he saw her standing in front of him. She is identical to his youthful love who disappeared 29 years ago. The elevator doors slid open with their familiar whisper, but Emmett Blackwood barely noticed the sound that had punctuated his mornings for the past 15 years. His mind was elsewhere, lost in spreadsheets, merger proposals, and the endless stream of decisions that came with running a multi-billion-dollar empire. At 52, he'd perfected the art of compartmentalizing his life into neat, manageable sections: business, philanthropy, and the carefully guarded solitude he'd wrapped around himself like armor. He stepped into the marble-floored lobby of Blackwood Industries Nashville headquarters, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished stone with military precision. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the reception area, where his previous executive assistant had sat for nearly a decade before retiring last month. Today, he'd finally meet her replacement. Emmett had always prided himself on his ability to read people instantly, a skill that had served him well in boardrooms from New York to Tokyo. He could spot ambition, desperation, or deceit within the first 30 seconds of any conversation. It was a gift that had protected him from countless predators who saw his wealth as their ticket to easy street. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what happened when he rounded the corner toward his executive suite. She was sitting behind the mahogany desk, her head bent over what appeared to be employee orientation paperwork. Auburn hair fell in gentle waves around her shoulders, catching the morning light in a way that made his breath hitch unexpectedly when she looked up at the sound of his approaching footsteps. Emmett's world tilted off its axis. Green eyes, not just any green, but that specific shade of emerald that had haunted his dreams for 29 years. Eyes that sparkled with intelligence and determination, framed by dark lashes that he remembered tracing with his fingertips on lazy Sunday mornings. The same delicate arch of eyebrows, the same full lips that had whispered, "I love you," against his ear on countless nights. The papers in his hand fluttered to the floor. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said, rising gracefully from her chair. Her voice was different, slightly deeper, more professional, but there was something in the cadence that sent shivers down his spine. "I'm Clara Whitfield, your new executive assistant. I'm so grateful for this opportunity." Emmett stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at a ghost made flesh. The rational part of his brain screamed that this was impossible. Evelyn Marlowe had vanished 29 years ago, leaving only a heartbreaking letter and a void that no amount of success or wealth had ever been able to fill. But standing before him was her exact duplicate. Every feature, every expression, even the way she tilted her head slightly when she spoke. "Mr. Blackwood." Clara's voice held a note of concern. "Are you feeling all right? Should I call someone?" He blinked hard, trying to ground himself in reality. This wasn't Evelyn. Evelyn would be 52 now, not the 20-something woman standing before him. This was Clara Whitfield. He'd personally reviewed her resume, her background check, her references. She was real. She was here, and she was looking at him with growing worry in those impossibly familiar eyes. "I'm fine," he managed, his voice coming out rougher than intended. He bent to collect the scattered papers, using the moment to compose himself. "Sorry, I was thinking about a particularly challenging merger. Welcome to Blackwood Industries, Ms. Whitfield." Clara relaxed slightly, though she continued to study his face with those perceptive eyes. "Thank you, sir. I've been going through the orientation materials, and I have to say, I'm impressed by everything the company has accomplished. The renewable energy division alone is revolutionary." Emmett straightened, papers clutched in his suddenly sweaty palms. "Focus," he told himself. "This is your new assistant, not a resurrection of your past." But every time he looked at her, his mind superimposed memories over reality. Evelyn laughing at his terrible jokes. Evelyn curled against him during Nashville's rare snowstorms. Evelyn saying yes when he'd proposed on bended knee in Centennial Park. "Have you had a chance to review today's schedule?" he asked, retreating behind the safety of business formality. "Yes, sir. You have the Morrison Industries call at 10, lunch with the mayor's environmental committee at noon, and the quarterly board meeting at 3. I also took the liberty of rescheduling your 4:30 with Henderson Consulting." They requested to move it to Thursday due to a family emergency. Her efficiency was impressive, but it was the way she moved that nearly undid him. The same graceful gestures, the same habit of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear when she concentrated. Even the small birthmark on her neck, a tiny crescent moon just below her left ear, was identical to Evelyn's. That's perfect, he stammered, backing toward his office door. I'll be in my office if you need anything. The employee handbook should cover most questions, but don't hesitate to ask if something comes up. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, Clara's voice stopped him just as his hand touched the door handle. I wanted to mention, my mother is dealing with some health issues right now. I promise it won't interfere with my work, but there might be occasional medical appointments I'll need to attend. I hope that won't be a problem. Something in her tone, a vulnerability beneath the professional polish, reminded him so strongly of Evelyn that his chest tightened. Evelyn had lost her own mother young, and had been fiercely protective of the few family members she had left. Of course, he said softly, family comes first. We'll work around whatever you need. Clara's smile was radiant, transforming her face in a way that sent another shock of recognition through him. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. That means more than you know. As he escaped into his office and closed the door behind him, Emmett collapsed into his leather chair with shaking hands, the walls of his sanctuary, filled with awards, photographs of business achievements, and carefully selected art, seemed to close in around him. He reached for the bottom drawer of his desk, where he kept the one photograph he'd never been able to throw away. Evelyn smiled up at him from the faded image, her green eyes bright with love and trust. She was wearing the simple white sundress she'd favored during their courtship. Standing in the gardens of his family's estate in Kentucky, he'd taken the picture just weeks before she'd disappeared, before his world had crumbled around him. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Not just physical, but in the way Clara carried herself, the way she spoke, even the way she'd smiled. It was as if the universe had decided to play the cruelest joke imaginable, dangling his lost love in front of him in a form he could never have. Outside his office, he could hear Clara moving around, settling into her new workspace. The soft sound of typing, the occasional rustle of papers, the gentle hum of someone who belonged in that space. For the first time in 29 years, Emmett Blackwood felt hope stirring in his chest, followed immediately by a crushing wave of fear. What if this was his second chance? What if fate had brought Clara into his life for a reason? Or what if pursuing these feelings would only lead to another devastating loss? As Clara's laughter drifted through the door, a sound so achingly familiar it made his heart race, Emmett realized that his carefully ordered world was about to become very complicated indeed. The Morrison Industries call had been a disaster. Emmett found himself agreeing to terms he'd normally never consider. His attention fractured every time Clara's voice filtered through the intercom, or her silhouette passed by his glass office walls. By the time he hung up, he'd essentially handed Morrison a 15% advantage in their joint venture, something that would have his board members questioning his judgment if they knew, but he couldn't focus. Every sound Clara made, every glimpse of her moving through the outer office, sent his mind spiraling back to memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. 29 years ago. You can't be serious about this girl, Emmett. His father's voice echoed across the mahogany-paneled study of the Blackwood estate, ice clinking in his bourbon glass. Silas Blackwood was a man who'd built an empire through ruthless determination, and he viewed his son's romantic entanglements as potential threats to the family legacy. Her name is Evelyn, Dad. And yes, I'm serious, dead serious. 23-year-old Emmett had stood his ground that night, though his hands trembled slightly as he faced his father's disapproval. I'm going to marry her. Over my dead body. Silas's words had been delivered with the cold precision of a business negotiation. She's a nobody, Emmett. A pretty face with empty pockets and no connections. The Blackwood name means something in this state, in this country. I won't have you throwing it away on some small-town waitress. She's not just some waitress, Emmett had fired back, his young voice cracking with emotion. She's brilliant. She's kind. She's everything I want in a partner. And whether you approve or not, I'm asking her to marry me next week. The slap had echoed through the study like a gunshot. Emmett's hand unconsciously moved to his cheek, the phantom sting still vivid after all these years. He'd left that night with a diamond ring in his pocket and determination in his heart. Driving straight to the modest apartment Evelyn shared with two roommates near Vanderbilt University, she'd said yes through tears of joy, throwing her arms around his neck as they stood on her tiny balcony overlooking the city lights. They'd spent hours planning their future. A small ceremony, a honeymoon in Ireland where her grandparents had been born, children who would grow up knowing love instead of the cold calculation that had defined Emmett's own childhood for 2 weeks. They'd been deliriously happy. Then came the morning he'd found her apartment empty, her roommates gone, and nothing left but a single envelope on the kitchen counter. His hands had shaken as he'd read her farewell letter, each word cutting deeper than any physical blow his father had ever delivered. "My dearest Emmett, our love is impossible. I'm not strong enough to fight the forces working against us, and I won't be the reason your family tears itself apart. Please don't look for me. Please try to forget me. You deserve a love that doesn't require you to choose between your heart and your blood. Forgive me for not being brave enough to say goodbye in person. Forever yours, Evelyn." A soft knock on his office door yanked Emmett back to the present. Clara peered in, her expression professional but tinged with concern. "Mr. Blackwood, the mayor's office called. They need to reschedule lunch to next Tuesday. Apparently there's been some kind of emergency with the downtown development project. Should I find you something else for this afternoon? Or would you prefer to keep the time open?" Emmett studied her face, searching for any hint of recognition, any sign that she felt the same inexplicable connection that was driving him slowly insane. But Clara simply waited patiently for his response, her green eyes focused and alert. "Keep it open," he said finally. "Actually, I was wondering, how is your mother doing? You mentioned she was having health issues." Something shifted in Clara's expression, a flash of vulnerability that made her seem younger, more fragile. It's pretty serious, actually. The doctors think it might be her heart, but we're still waiting on some test results. The medical bills are already starting to pile up, and She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear about my personal problems." "Clara." The name felt strange on his tongue, familiar yet foreign. "If you need assistance with medical expenses, the company has an employee hardship fund. It's designed specifically for situations like this." Her eyes widened. "That's incredibly generous, Mr. Blackwood, but I couldn't possibly—" "It's not charity," he interrupted gently. "It's a benefit available to all employees. You just started. But your references were impeccable, and I can already tell you're going to be a valuable asset to this company. Let me have HR send you the paperwork." For a moment, Clara looked as though she might cry. The expression was so achingly familiar that Emmett had to grip the edge of his desk to keep from reaching out to comfort her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." After she left, Emmett pulled out his cell phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Marcus Webb, the private investigator he'd used for various corporate security matters over the years. Webb was discreet, thorough, and didn't ask unnecessary questions, exactly what Emmett needed right now. "Marcus, it's Emmett Blackwood. I need you to run a background check on someone. Complete history, family records, everything you can find. Yes, I know I usually go through corporate channels for employee screening. This is different. Her name is Clara Whitfield, 28 years old, currently residing in Nashville." As he provided Webb with the details from Clara's employment file, Emmett felt a familiar guilt gnawing at his conscience. He was violating her privacy, investigating her like a potential security threat when she'd done nothing wrong. But he had to know. The similarities were too striking to be mere coincidence. That evening, Emmett sat in his penthouse overlooking the Cumberland River, nursing a glass of bourbon and staring at the city lights reflected in the water below. His housekeeper had left dinner warming in the oven, but he had no appetite. The spacious apartment felt more like a mausoleum than a home, all elegant furniture and expensive art, but no warmth, no life. He'd bought this place 5 years after Evelyn's disappearance, when living in the house they'd planned to share became unbearable. Every room had held memories of conversations about their future, dreams they'd woven together in the brief, shining weeks of their engagement. He'd sold it to a young couple with children, hoping they'd fill it with the laughter and love it had been designed for. His phone buzzed with a text message. Glancing at the screen, he saw it was from Webb. Initial findings interesting. Agnes Whitfield, Clara's adoptive mother, worked at Blackwood Ranch 1995-1996. Disappeared suddenly in spring '96. We'll have full report tomorrow. Emmett's bourbon glass slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Agnes Whitfield. The name hit him like a physical blow. Memories flooding back with crystalline clarity. Agnes had been one of the housekeeping staff at his family's Kentucky estate. A quiet woman in her late 30s who'd kept to herself and done her job without fanfare. He remembered her because she'd been kind to Evelyn during the few times he'd brought her to meet his family. One of the only staff members who'd treated his fiancée with genuine warmth instead of the suspicious deference most had shown, and she'd disappeared right around the time Evelyn had vanished. The coincidence was impossible to ignore, as Emmett knelt to pick up the pieces of broken glass. His hands trembling with a mixture of anticipation and dread, he realized that his carefully controlled world was about to be turned completely upside down. Whatever Webb discovered in his investigation, Emmett suspected it would change everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd loved and lost, and the mysterious young woman who'd walked back into his life wearing Evelyn's face. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather to Nashville, but Clara barely noticed as she hurried through the lobby of Blackwood Industries. Her mother had been up most of the night with chest pains, and the emergency room visit had left Clara exhausted and even more worried about their mounting medical bills. The Employee Hardship Fund paperwork sat in her purse. She'd filled it out 3 times before finally working up the courage to submit it. "Good morning, Clara." Emmett's voice startled her as she settled into her desk chair. He was standing by the coffee station, 2 steaming mugs in his hands. "You look tired. Rough night." The simple gesture of concern made her throat tighten unexpectedly. In her previous jobs, bosses had barely acknowledged her existence, let alone noticed when she was having a difficult time. "Mom had another episode. We spent half the night at the ER, but the doctors say it's just part of the process while they figure out her treatment plan." Emmett set one of the coffee mugs on her desk, and she caught a whiff of vanilla and cinnamon, her exact preference, though she was certain she'd never mentioned it to him. "Have you had breakfast?" "I'll grab something later," Clara said automatically, though her stomach growled in protest. She'd been surviving on vending machine snacks and whatever samples the hospital cafeteria offered to families in the waiting room. "There's a great cafe downstairs. Why don't you take an early lunch break and get yourself a proper meal? My treat." Before she could protest, Emmett pulled out his wallet and placed 2 $20 bills on her desk. "And Clara, take your time. The Morrison follow-up calls can wait." As he disappeared into his office, Clara stared at the money with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Emmett Blackwood was being incredibly kind, but there was something in the way he looked at her, an intensity that made her skin tingle and her pulse quicken. She'd caught him watching her several times yesterday, his dark eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't predatory exactly, more like recognition, as if he was seeing someone else when he looked at her. The morning passed quietly, with Clara efficiently handling calls and correspondence while Emmett worked behind his closed office door. She was beginning to understand his rhythms. He was most focused in the morning, preferred to handle difficult negotiations before lunch, and had a habit of unconsciously drumming his fingers when he was thinking through complex problems. Around 11:30, her personal phone buzzed with a call from her mother's assisted living facility. "Miss Whitfield, this is Janet from Sunny Vale. Your mother is asking for you. She seems quite agitated this morning, talking about things from the past. We thought you might want to come by." Clara's heart sank. The episodes were becoming more frequent. Moments when Agnes would become fixated on memories from decades ago, speaking in fragments about people and events Clara didn't recognize. The doctors said it was a combination of medication side effects and the stress of her illness. But it was heartbreaking to watch. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Clara said, already reaching for her purse. "Clara," Emmett had emerged from his office, clearly having overheard part of the conversation. "Everything okay? My mother's having one of her confused episodes. I need to go see her." Clara stood, gathering her things with shaking hands. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I know you said family comes first, but I feel terrible leaving on my second day. Go." His voice was firm but gentle. "Take the rest of the day if you need it. We'll manage here." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. I promise I'll make up the time." "Clara." Emmett stepped closer, and she caught a hint of his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her feel slightly dizzy. "You don't need to apologize for taking care of your family. That's what decent people do." The drive to Sunnyvale took 40 minutes through Nashville traffic, giving Clara time to worry about what state she'd find her mother in. These episodes were unpredictable. Sometimes Agnes would be lucid by the time Clara arrived, apologetic and embarrassed. Other times, she'd be deep in the grip of memories that seemed more real to her than the present. She found Agnes in the sunroom, staring out at the garden with wild eyes and trembling hands. "Mama." Clara knelt beside her mother's wheelchair, taking the older woman's cold fingers in her own. "It's me, Clara. I'm here." Agnes turned, her gaze unfocused. "Clara, no, you can't be here. It's not safe. He'll find out about the baby and then..." She gripped Clara's hands with surprising strength. "I should have told him the truth years ago. The guilt is eating me alive." "Mama, what baby? What truth?" Clara had heard fragments of these confused ramblings before, but they seemed more intense today. "You're at Sunnyvale, remember? You're safe here." "The baby," Agnes repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Evelyn's baby. I saved her, Clara. I saved her from those monsters. But I could never save her mother. Poor Evelyn. She trusted me, and I let her down." Clara's blood ran cold. Her mother had never mentioned anyone named Evelyn before. "Mama, who is Evelyn? When did you know someone named Evelyn?" But Agnes was retreating back into herself, her eyes growing distant again. "The roses," she murmured. "Evelyn loved the white roses in the garden. She said they reminded her of wedding dresses." Her voice trailed off, and she seemed to fall asleep, her breathing becoming slow and regular. A nurse approached quietly. "She's been like this since about 9 this morning, talking about babies and someone named Evelyn, and something about the Blackwood Ranch. We thought it might mean something to you." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Blackwood Ranch? Her mother had mentioned her current employer's family property during one of her confused episodes. The coincidence was too strange to ignore. Did she say anything else about the Blackwoods? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just that she worked there once, a long time ago, and something about owing a debt that could never be repaid." The nurse's expression was sympathetic. "I'm sorry, honey. When they get like this, it's hard to know what's real memory and what's just the confusion talking." Clara sat with her mother for another hour, but Agnes remained deeply asleep. The drive back to the office gave her time to think about what she'd heard. Her mother had worked at Blackwood Ranch, Emmett's family property. But when and who was Evelyn? Agnes had always been secretive about her past, changing the subject whenever Clara asked about life before she'd adopted her. She'd always assumed it was because her mother's early years had been difficult, maybe even traumatic. But what if there were specific secrets Agnes was protecting when Clara returned to Blackwood Industries? She found Emmett waiting for her in the lobby, his expression concerned. "How is she?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the elevators. "Confused. She was talking about the past again. People I don't recognize." Clara hesitated, then decided to take a risk. She mentioned working at a place called Blackwood Ranch. "I know it's probably just a coincidence, but..." Emmett stopped walking so abruptly that Clara took several steps before realizing he was no longer beside her. When she turned, his face had gone completely white. What exactly did she say about the ranch? His voice was tight, controlled. Just that she worked there once, and she kept talking about someone named Evelyn and a baby. Clara studied his expression, noting the way his jaw had clenched. "Mr. Blackwood, do you know who Evelyn is?" For a long moment, Emmett said nothing. Then, his voice barely audible, he whispered, "Evelyn was the woman I was supposed to marry. She disappeared 29 years ago, right before our wedding." The elevator arrived with a soft chime, but neither of them moved to get on. Clara felt the world tilting around her, pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand beginning to shift into a pattern that terrified her. "Mr. Blackwood," she said slowly, "I think we need to talk." Emmett's office felt smaller than usual as Clara sat across from his desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the weight of secrets hanging between them. "Tell me about Evelyn," Clara said quietly. "Please." Emmett leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he studied her face. Even now, knowing there had to be some connection between Clara and his past, the resemblance was staggering. She was everything to me. We met at a charity function in 1995. She was working as a server to pay for night classes at Vanderbilt, studying literature and education. His voice grew softer as the memories took hold. Evelyn had this way of seeing beauty in everything. Old buildings that others wanted to tear down, stray cats that followed her home, people that society had written off. She made me want to be better than I was. Clara listened intently, unconsciously mirroring Emmett's posture in a way that made his chest tighten. What happened to her? We got engaged in March of 1996. My father, he wasn't pleased. The Blackwoods have always married within certain social circles. And Evelyn didn't fit his vision for the family legacy. Emmett's jaw clenched at the memory. We fought about it constantly, but I didn't care. I loved her, and she loved me. He stood and moved to the window, unable to meet Clara's eyes as he continued. The wedding was planned for April 15th. Small ceremony, just family and close friends. But on April 14th, I went to her apartment to surprise her with a gift, and she was gone. No forwarding address, no goodbye except for a letter saying our love was impossible. Did you look for her? Everywhere. I hired private investigators, contacted every friend she'd ever mentioned, even put ads in newspapers across the country. It was like she'd simply vanished into thin air. Emmett turned back to face Clara, his expression haunted. I never found a single trace of where she'd gone or why she'd left. Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd heard. And you think my mother knew her? I know she did. Agnes worked at the ranch during that exact time period. She was part of the housekeeping staff, and she was always kind to Evelyn when I brought her to family gatherings. Emmett returned to his desk, pulling out a yellow legal pad. Clara, I need to ask you some questions about your background. I know it might seem intrusive, but ask whatever you need to ask. Clara's voice was steady, but Emmett could see the tension in her shoulders. I want to understand this as much as you do. When did Agnes adopt you? I was a baby. She always said I was about 6 months old when she took me in. Sometime in late 1996 or early 1997, she'd moved to Tennessee from Kentucky around that time. Emmett's pen stopped moving across the paper. The timeline fit perfectly. Evelyn had disappeared in April 1996, and Agnes had left the ranch around the same time, only to resurface in Tennessee with a baby 6 months later. Did she ever talk about why she left Kentucky? Or mention anyone from her time at the ranch? Clara shook her head slowly. She was always vague about her past. Whenever I'd ask about my birth parents or her life before me, she'd change the subject, or say that some things were better left buried. I used to think she was protecting me from painful truths about being abandoned. But now you're wondering if there's more to the story. Exactly. Clara leaned forward, her green eyes intense. Mr. Blackwood, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Do you think I look like her? Like Evelyn? The question hung in the air between them like a live wire. Emmett had been dreading this moment, knowing it would come but unprepared for the raw vulnerability in Clara's voice. Yes, he said simply. The resemblance is extraordinary. Clara's hand went unconsciously to her neck, touching the small crescent-shaped birthmark just below her left ear. This birthmark, did she have one like it? Emmett's world went silent, except for the thundering of his own heartbeat. Yes, exactly like that one. They stared at each other across the desk, both afraid to voice the possibility that was taking shape in their minds. The air in the office felt electric, charged with questions neither of them was ready to answer. Clara's phone buzzed, breaking the spell. She glanced at it, then paled. It's the nursing home. I need to take this. Miss Whitfield, your mother is asking for you again. She's become quite agitated and she keeps saying she needs to tell you something important before it's too late. She seems more lucid than this morning, but very upset. Clara looked at Emmett helplessly. I have to go to her. I'll drive you, Emmett said without hesitation. Mr. Blackwood, you don't need to. Clara? He stood, reaching for his keys. I think it's time I had a conversation with Agnes myself. The drive to Sunnyvale was tense, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Emmett found himself stealing glances at Clara's profile, noting the way she worried her lower lip when she was anxious, another gesture that was painfully familiar. Meanwhile, Clara was grappling with emotions she couldn't name. The attraction she'd felt toward Emmett since her first day was intensifying. Complicated now by the mystery surrounding their shared connection to Evelyn, there was something about him that felt like coming home, a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. They found Agnes sitting upright in her bed, her eyes clear and focused for the first time in weeks. When she saw Emmett behind Clara, her face went ashen. "Dear God," she whispered. "Emmett Blackwood." "Hello, Agnes." Emmett stepped closer to the bed, his voice gentle but firm. "I think it's time we talked about Evelyn." Agnes began to shake, her hands clutching the hospital blanket with white-knuckled desperation. "I can't. I promised I'd never. She made me swear." "Mama?" Clara sat on the edge of the bed, taking her mother's trembling hands. "Who made you swear? What promise?" "The baby," Agnes gasped, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I saved the baby, but I couldn't save her mother. Oh, Clara, my sweet girl. I never meant for you to work for him. I never meant for you to meet him. The irony is too cruel." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Mama, what are you saying?" Agnes looked between Clara and Emmett, her expression tormented. "I worked at the ranch. I saw things, terrible things when she disappeared. I knew it wasn't by choice. And when I found out about the baby..." She broke off, sobbing. "What baby, Agnes?" Emmett's voice was hoarse with emotion. Agnes looked directly at Clara, her eyes full of love and regret. "Your baby, Emmett. Yours and Evelyn's. Clara is your daughter." The words hit the room like a physical force. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at Emmett in shock. He had gone completely still, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "That's impossible," Clara whispered. "That can't be true." But even as she spoke, pieces were falling into place in her mind. The inexplicable attraction she'd felt toward Emmett, the way he'd looked at her with such intensity, the familiar comfort she'd found in his presence. "Agnes." Emmett's voice was barely audible. "Where is Evelyn? What happened to her?" Agnes closed her eyes, as if gathering courage for what came next. "She's dead, Emmett. She died giving birth to Clara, and the man who killed her was your own father." The revelation hung in the air like a death sentence, changing everything they thought they knew about their lives, their connection, and the dangerous game fate had been playing with them both. The silence in Agnes's hospital room was deafening. Clara felt as though the floor had opened beneath her feet, leaving her suspended in a nightmare that couldn't possibly be real. Across the room, Emmett stood frozen, his face drained of all color. "No," Clara whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, that's not. You're confused, Mama. You're sick, and the medication is making you..." "I'm dying, Clara." Agnes's voice was stronger now, carrying a finality that cut through her daughter's denial. "I don't have time for confusion anymore. I've carried this secret for 28 years, and it's been eating me alive. You deserve to know the truth, even if it destroys everything." Emmett finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Tell me what happened to her. Tell me everything." Agnes struggled to sit up straighter, her weathered hands smoothing the hospital blanket with nervous energy. "I need you both to understand something first. I was a coward back then. I was a single woman, barely making ends meet. And when Silas Blackwood offered me extra money to help with certain arrangements, I was desperate enough to say yes." "What kind of arrangements?" Clara asked, though part of her was terrified to hear the answer. "Your father, Silas, he couldn't stand that Emmett was going to marry beneath his social standing. He saw Evelyn as a threat to the family reputation, to their business interests. He tried bribing her first, offering her money to disappear, but she refused. She loved Emmett too much to be bought off." Agnes paused, gathering strength for what came next. "So Silas decided to take matters into his own hands. He told me he was going to give Evelyn a chance to reconsider her engagement to Emmett. He asked me to help arrange a meeting with her, somewhere private where they could talk." Emmett's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You helped him lure her away. I thought it was just going to be a conversation," Agnes cried, tears streaming down her face. "I swear to you, Emmett, I thought he was going to try reasoning with her, maybe offering her a more substantial sum to leave quietly. I never imagined..." She broke off, sobbing. Clara reached for her mother's hand, her own trembling. What happened then? I drove her to the meeting place, an old farmhouse about an hour outside Nashville that Silas owned. He told me to wait in the car, that he'd call me when they were finished talking. But hours passed, and when I finally got worried enough to go inside, Agnes shuddered. She was tied up in the back bedroom, unconscious. There were 2 men with Silas that I'd never seen before. Hired muscle. The room began to spin around Clara. She gripped the bed rail, fighting off waves of nausea as the full horror of what her mother was describing sank in. Silas saw the look on my face and laughed. Agnes continued, her voice hollow with remembered trauma. He said Evelyn had been given a chance to do this the easy way, but she'd chosen the hard way instead. He told me she was going to stay at the farmhouse until she came to her senses and wrote a proper goodbye letter to Emmett. The letter, Emmett whispered, the one saying our love was impossible. He forced her to write it, threatened to hurt you if she didn't make it convincing. She fought him for days before she finally broke down and wrote what he wanted. Agnes wiped her eyes with a shaking hand. I wanted to call the police to tell someone what was happening, but Silas made it clear that I was now an accessory to kidnapping. He said if I breathed a word to anyone, I'd go to prison and Evelyn would disappear permanently. Clara felt sick. The woman who had raised her with such love and kindness had been trapped in an impossible situation, forced to become complicit in an unthinkable crime. How long did they keep her there? Emmett's voice was deadly quiet. Months. Silas's plan was to break her spirit completely, then eventually release her somewhere far away, where she could never find her way back to you. He thought, if enough time passed, you'd move on and find someone more suitable. Agnes's expression grew even more pained. But then we discovered she was pregnant. The words hit Emmett like a physical blow. He staggered backward, catching himself against the wall. Pregnant. She was carrying my child. About 3 months along when we found out, Silas was furious. A baby would complicate everything, but Evelyn, oh, that child gave her strength she didn't know she had. She started fighting back, planning escapes, threatening to expose everything if anything happened to her baby. Agnes looked directly at Clara, her eyes full of love and sorrow. You were her hope, sweetheart. She used to talk to you when she thought no one was listening, telling you stories about your father, about the life you'd have together once you were all free. Clara was openly crying now, her heart breaking for the mother she'd never known, and the father sitting across the room who'd spent nearly 3 decades believing the woman he loved had abandoned him. The birth was difficult, Agnes continued. We were at the farmhouse, no proper medical care. I'd worked as a nurse's aide years before, so I did what I could, but she took a shuddering breath. She hemorrhaged. There was nothing I could do to save her. With her last breath, she made me promise to get you to safety and to tell Emmett the truth someday. So you took the baby and ran, Emmett said. That same night, I knew Silas would never let Clara live. She was evidence of what he'd done. I packed what I could carry and disappeared with her. I had some money saved, enough to start over in a new state with a new identity. Agnes reached for Clara's hand. I gave you my maiden name, Whitfield, and told everyone you were my adopted daughter. It wasn't entirely a lie. Clara struggled to process everything she'd heard. The man she'd been falling for was her biological father. The attraction she'd felt. The sense of belonging. It had all been some twisted cosmic joke. Where did you bury her? Emmett asked quietly. There's a small cemetery behind the old Baptist church in Dixon County. I know the groundskeeper. He let me bury her there quietly. No official records. I visit her grave every year on Clara's birthday. Agnes squeezed Clara's hand. I should have told you both the truth years ago, but I was terrified. Silas Blackwood was a powerful man, and even after he died, I worried about what would happen if the truth came out. Emmett moved to the window, staring out at the parking lot as he tried to absorb the magnitude of what he'd learned. His father had kidnapped and murdered the woman he loved, then let him spend nearly 3 decades believing she'd abandoned him. And Clara, beautiful, kind Clara, was the daughter he'd never known he had. There's more, Agnes said softly. Both Clara and Emmett turned to look at her, though neither was sure they could handle any more revelations. Before she died, Evelyn wrote you a letter, Clara. She made me promise to give it to you if something ever happened to her. I've kept it all these years, hidden in my jewelry box at the apartment. Agnes's voice grew urgent. "You need to read it. Both of you need to read it." She explains everything. About her love for your father, about her hopes for your future, about forgiveness. Clara stood on unsteady legs, her world completely transformed by the truth that had been hidden for so long. As she looked at Emmett, her father, she saw her own devastation reflected in his eyes. Everything had changed. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, her growing feelings for the man who had shown her such kindness, had been built on lies and buried secrets. The truth had finally surfaced, but Clara wasn't sure any of them would survive it. The drive to Agnes's apartment was conducted in suffocating silence. Clara sat in the passenger seat of Emmett's Mercedes, staring out the window at the Nashville streets that suddenly felt foreign and threatening. Everything looked the same, but her entire world had been turned inside out in the span of an hour. She was Emmett Blackwood's daughter, the man she'd been falling for, whose presence had felt like coming home, whose touch had sent electricity through her veins. He was her father. The thought made her stomach churn with a mixture of horror and shame that she couldn't begin to process. Beside her, Emmett gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His jaw was clenched, and she could see a muscle twitching in his cheek as he fought to maintain control. The silence between them wasn't just awkward, it was toxic, filled with all the things they couldn't say, couldn't even think about. Agnes had given Clara her apartment key before they left the nursing home, her hands shaking as she described where to find Evelyn's letter. "It's in my bedroom, in the wooden jewelry box on the dresser, behind the velvet lining in the bottom compartment. She made me promise to keep it safe until the right time came." "How will I know when it's the right time?" Clara had asked. Agnes had looked at her with infinite sadness. "You'll know now," as they pulled into the parking lot of the modest apartment complex where Clara had grown up. She realized that time had arrived, whether she was ready for it or not. The apartment felt smaller than usual, heavy with 28 years of carefully guarded secrets. Clara had always loved this place. It was filled with warm memories of bedtime stories, homework help, and the quiet comfort of a woman who had loved her completely, despite the circumstances of their relationship. But now she wondered how many lies had been woven into those loving moments. "She kept your room exactly the same," Clara said quietly, as they stood in the narrow hallway. "Even after I moved out, she said it would always be my home." Emmett didn't respond. He was studying the framed photographs that lined the walls. Pictures of Clara at various ages, school events, graduations, his daughter's entire life, documented and cherished by a woman who had risked everything to save her. In Agnes's bedroom, Clara opened the jewelry box with trembling fingers. It was an old wooden chest that played Für Elise when the lid was lifted, a melody that had lulled her to sleep countless times as a child. She carefully removed the velvet lining from the bottom compartment, revealing a sealed envelope underneath. Written on the front in faded ink were the words, "For my beloved daughter, Clara Evelyn." "She gave me her mother's name as my middle name," Clara whispered, her vision blurring with tears. Emmett sat heavily on the edge of Agnes's bed, his head in his hands. "I can't do this, Clara. I can't read that letter. Not yet." Clara understood. The emotional weight of the day had already pushed them both to their breaking points, but she needed to know what her mother had written, needed some guidance for how to navigate the impossible situation they now found themselves in. She opened the envelope carefully, revealing several pages of delicate handwriting. As she began to read, her mother's voice seemed to fill the room. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am no longer with you. I pray that Agnes has kept her promise, and that you are safe, healthy, and surrounded by love. I want you to know that you were conceived in the purest love imaginable. Your father, Emmett Blackwood, is a good man who was deceived about my fate. He believes I left him willingly, but nothing could be further from the truth. I would have fought heaven and earth to return to him if I could. The man responsible for keeping us apart is Emmett's father, Silas. He is consumed by pride and fear, unable to see that love transcends social boundaries. Do not hate him for what he has done. Hatred will only poison your heart, as it has poisoned his, Clara. My precious daughter, you are the best of both worlds. You have your father's strength and intelligence, but I hope you also carry within you the capacity for forgiveness and joy. The world will try to tell you that some loves are impossible, but I want you to know that our love, yours, mine, and your father's, is the most possible thing in this universe. If fate brings you and Emmett together someday, please do not let the circumstances of our separation destroy the chance for your own relationship. He has suffered enough for crimes he did not commit. Help him heal, as I know he will help you grow into the remarkable woman I see in my dreams. Agnes has promised to love you as her own, and I know she will keep that promise. But never forget that you are a Blackwood by blood and a child of love by choice. Your heritage is one of strength, not shame. Live fully, my darling. Love deeply, and know that every breath you take is a testament to the power of hope over despair. Forever your mother, Evelyn Marlowe P.S. I have hidden something for you behind the loose brick in Agnes's garden. Someday when you're ready, it will help you understand the depth of your father's love for me, and mine for him. Clara's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pages. The letter was a gift and a burden, proof of her mother's love, but also a reminder of the tragic circumstances that had shaped her entire existence. What does it say? Emmett asked quietly. Clara looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time since learning the truth, the resemblance was undeniable now that she knew to look for it. She had his dark hair, his determined chin, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. How had they not seen it before? She forgives you, Clara said simply. She wants us to forgive each other. Emmett let out a sound that was part laugh, part sob. Forgive each other for what? For my father's crimes, for the attraction we felt before we knew the truth. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Clara, I looked at you and felt, God help me. I thought about kissing you. I thought about what it would be like to... Stop. Clara's voice was sharp. Just stop. We didn't know. We couldn't have known. But I should have seen it. The resemblance, the timing, the fact that Agnes worked at the ranch, I should have put it together before. He turned to face her, his expression tortured. Before I started falling in love with my own daughter. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Clara felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, exactly, but something deeper. The innocent attraction she'd felt. The sense of coming home in his presence. The growing affection that had felt so right just hours ago. All of it was now tainted beyond repair. I need to go, she whispered, moving toward the door. Clara, wait. No. She turned back to him, tears streaming down her face. I can't be here right now. I can't look at you and not think about... I just can't. She fled the apartment, leaving Emmett alone with his grief and the letter that had revealed the truth of his daughter's existence. As she drove aimlessly through Nashville's winding streets, Clara felt the full weight of her mother's sacrifice and her father's unwitting betrayal. The cruelest irony was that Evelyn's letter had been written with love and hope, encouraging a relationship between father and daughter. But how could they ever bridge the gap that had been created by their initial attraction? How could they look at each other without remembering the feelings that should never have existed? Clara pulled over at a gas station and called in sick to work for the next day. Knowing she needed time to process everything that had happened, she couldn't face going back to Blackwood Industries, couldn't sit across from Emmett and pretend to be his employee when the truth of their relationship had changed everything as night fell over Nashville. Both father and daughter were left to grapple with a truth that had set them free and destroyed them in the same moment. 3 days passed before Emmett could bring himself to return to his office. He'd spent the time in his penthouse, drinking too much bourbon and staring at the city lights. Trying to make sense of a world that had become unrecognizable, every surface in his home seemed to mock him. The expensive art he'd collected to fill the emptiness. The awards celebrating business achievements that felt meaningless now. The silence that had once been his refuge but now felt like a tomb. His phone had rung constantly, board members wanting updates on quarterly projections, business partners seeking approval for new ventures, his assistant's replacement, an efficient woman in her 50s who bore no resemblance whatsoever to anyone from his past, calling to reschedule meetings. But the one call he desperately wanted never came. Clara had vanished as completely as her mother had 29 years ago. On the morning of the 4th day, Emmett finally forced himself to shower, dress, and drive to Blackwood Industries. He had responsibilities, obligations that couldn't be ignored indefinitely, But as he sat behind his desk, attempting to focus on contracts and correspondence, he found himself staring at Clara's empty workstation through his glass office walls. Her personal items were gone. The small, succulent plant she'd brought from home, the framed photo of her and Agnes at Clara's college graduation, the coffee mug with a chip in the handle that she'd insisted was lucky. All of it had disappeared sometime during his 3-day absence. "Sir?" His temporary assistant knocked on the doorframe. "I'm sorry to bother you, but Mrs. Whitfield's final paycheck needs your approval, and there's some paperwork regarding her resignation that requires your signature." Resignation. The word hit him like a physical blow. Clara had quit via email, apparently, though he hadn't seen the message, hadn't wanted to see it. "Send it to my personal email," he said quietly. "I'll handle it from there." Alone again, Emmett opened his laptop and found Clara's resignation buried among dozens of other messages he'd been ignoring. The email was brief and professional, thanking him for the opportunity and expressing regret that personal circumstances required her immediate departure from the company. There was no mention of their conversation with Agnes, no acknowledgement of the truth that had shattered both their lives. It was exactly the kind of polite, distant farewell Evelyn had written 29 years ago. Formal words designed to provide closure while revealing nothing of the writer's true feelings. The parallel made his stomach turn. That afternoon, Emmett found himself driving to Agnes's apartment complex. He told himself he was going there to check on the elderly woman's condition, but he knew he was really hoping to find some trace of Clara. The apartment manager informed him that Clara had been by the previous day to collect some of her mother's things, but she hadn't left a forwarding address. She seemed real upset about something, the manager said, studying Emmett with curious eyes. Kept crying while she was packing. Asked me to put the apartment on the market. Said she couldn't afford to keep it anymore with her mama in the nursing home. The words struck Emmett with sudden clarity. Clara was running out of money. Agnes's medical bills, the cost of the nursing home, the loss of her job. She was probably facing financial ruin on top of the emotional devastation of learning the truth about her parentage. He drove to Sunnyvale, hoping Agnes might know where Clara had gone, but found the elderly woman in worse condition than before. The stress of revealing her long-held secrets seemed to have accelerated her decline. She slept most of the time now, and when she was awake, she was often confused and disoriented. "She came to see me yesterday," Agnes whispered during a brief moment of lucidity. "My Clara, she looked so lost, so frightened. I tried to tell her it would be all right, that love finds a way, but she couldn't hear me through her pain." "Did she say where she was going?" Agnes shook her head weakly. "She kissed my forehead and said she needed time to think. Said she'd be back when she figured out how to be my daughter and your daughter at the same time." Her eyes filled with tears. "I've destroyed everything, haven't I? I should have told the truth years ago." Emmett took her frail hand in his. "You saved her life, Agnes. You gave her 28 years of love and security that she never would have had otherwise. That's not destruction. That's the greatest gift one person can give another." But even as he spoke the words, Emmett felt the weight of his own guilt settling deeper into his bones. His father's crimes had started this chain of tragedy, but Emmett's own feelings had completed it. If he hadn't looked at Clara with desire instead of recognition, if he hadn't allowed himself to develop romantic feelings for her, maybe they could have found a way to navigate the truth together. Instead, his inappropriate attraction had poisoned any chance of a healthy father-daughter relationship before it could even begin. That evening, Emmett sat in his study, staring at a bottle of sleeping pills he'd found in his medicine cabinet. The label was dated from the year after Evelyn's disappearance, when nightmares and grief had made sleep impossible. He'd never used them, eventually finding other ways to cope with his insomnia. But now they seemed to offer a different kind of relief. 29 years of believing he'd been abandoned by the woman he loved. 29 years of guilt and self-doubt, wondering what he'd done wrong to drive Evelyn away. And now, the crushing knowledge that she'd died calling his name, that their child had grown up without knowing her father's love, that his own father had orchestrated the entire tragedy. The sins of Silas Blackwood had destroyed 3 generations. Evelyn was dead. Clara was lost and traumatized. And Emmett was tired of carrying the weight of crimes he'd never committed but had somehow inherited. He opened the bottle and shook several pills into his palm. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built an empire, accumulated wealth beyond most people's dreams. wielded power that could change lives and reshape industries. But he couldn't undo his father's cruelty, couldn't bring back the woman he'd loved, couldn't erase the inappropriate feelings he'd developed for his own daughter. The pills were small and white, innocuous-looking things that promised peace. His phone rang, startling him so badly that the pills scattered across his desk. The caller ID showed Agnes's nursing home. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry to call so late, but Agnes Whitfield is asking for you. She's not expected to make it through the night, and she says there's something important she needs to tell you before she goes." Emmett stared at the scattered pills for a long moment, then swept them back into the bottle. Agnes was dying, and she'd asked for him. Whatever else had happened, whatever guilt he carried, he owed it to the woman who'd saved his daughter's life to be there in her final moments as he drove through the empty Nashville streets toward Sunny Vale. Emmett realized that the sleeping pills would still be there tomorrow if he chose to use them. But Agnes Whitfield, the woman who'd carried his secrets for nearly 3 decades, would not. Some obligations transcended personal pain, some promises had to be kept, even when keeping them felt impossible. When he arrived at the nursing home, Agnes was waiting for him with eyes that were clear. Despite her failing body, she had something to tell him, she said. Something about Clara that would change everything he thought he knew about where his daughter had gone. Agnes's voice was barely a whisper when Emmett reached her bedside, but her words were crystal clear. "The cemetery, behind the old Baptist church on Highway 46 in Dixon County. She's there, Emmett. Evelyn is waiting for both of you." "I don't understand," Emmett said, leaning closer to hear her fading voice. "Clara found the letter, the one I told her about, hidden in my garden. She knows where her mother is buried now." Agnes's breathing was labored, each word an effort. "She went there yesterday. My neighbor saw her digging behind the loose brick, just like Evelyn told her to do in the letter." Agnes gripped his hand with surprising strength. "You need to find her, Emmett. She's in so much pain, carrying guilt that isn't hers to bear. She thinks she's somehow responsible for the feelings between you, thinks she's tainted by what happened. But she's just a child who never knew her parents' love. Agnes, listen to me." Her voice gained urgency despite her weakness. "In my jewelry box, there's another letter, one Evelyn wrote for you, in case we ever found you alive. She wanted you to know. She wanted you to understand that none of this was your fault." Agnes's eyes were growing distant. Clara needs her father, Emmett, not the man who looked at her with desire, but the father who can help her heal from all of this. Agnes passed away 20 minutes later, her last breath a peaceful sigh as the monitors flatlined. Emmett sat with her for a long time, holding the hand of the woman who'd saved his daughter's life and carried impossible secrets for nearly 3 decades, whatever her role in the initial tragedy. She'd spent her life making amends, loving Clara with the fierce devotion of a mother protecting her child. By dawn, Emmett was driving through the rolling hills of Dixon County, following GPS directions to the abandoned Baptist church Agnes had described. The building came into view as the sun crested the horizon, a small white clapboard structure with a bell tower that had lost its bell decades ago. Weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot, and the paint was peeling from the wooden siding behind the church. A wrought iron gate marked the entrance to a small cemetery, filled with weathered headstones dating back to the 1800s. Most were simple markers bearing names and dates, the stories of lives lived and lost in rural Tennessee. He found Clara sitting on the ground beside a modest headstone in the back corner of the cemetery, her knees drawn up to her chest and her face streaked with tears. She was holding something in her hands, a small wooden box that looked handmade. For a moment, Emmett hesitated. The scene before him was achingly intimate, his daughter mourning at her mother's grave. Surrounded by the peaceful silence of the countryside, he felt like an intruder in this sacred space. But then Clara looked up and saw him, and the raw pain in her eyes made his decision for him. "Agnes told me I'd find you here," he said quietly. Approaching slowly so as not to startle her, Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "She died, didn't she? I could feel it somehow, like something important had left the world." Emmett nodded, settling on the ground beside her with careful distance between them. "Peacefully, she asked me to find you." They sat in silence for several minutes, both staring at the simple granite marker that read, "Evelyn Marlowe, beloved mother, 1973-1996. Someone, Agnes presumably, had planted white roses around the grave. They were blooming now, their petals scattered on the grass like tears. "I found this," Clara said finally, holding up the wooden box. It was exactly where Mom said it would be, behind the loose brick in Agnes's garden. She left it for me before she died. "What's inside?" Clara opened the box with trembling fingers, revealing a collection of items that took Emmett's breath away. There were photographs, pictures of him and Evelyn together that he'd forgotten existed, a pressed flower from their first date, the engagement ring he'd given her, the one he'd assumed was lost forever, and underneath it all, sealed in plastic to protect it from moisture, was another letter. "She wrote to you too," Clara said, handing him the envelope. Agnes was right. Mom wanted you to know the truth. Emmett's hands shook as he opened the letter, recognizing Evelyn's delicate handwriting immediately. "My dearest Emmett, if you are reading this, then our daughter has found her way to you, and Agnes has finally told the truth we've all been carrying. I pray that you can forgive an old woman's fear and a young woman's desperation for the lies that have kept us apart. I need you to know that every day of my captivity, I dreamed of returning to you. When your father's men took me, I fought them with everything I had. When they forced me to write that letter saying our love was impossible, I died a little inside, knowing how those words would wound you. But then I discovered I was carrying your child, and suddenly, I had something worth fighting for, beyond my own freedom. Our baby became my hope, my strength, my reason to survive each day in that terrible place. I used to talk to her while she was still inside me, telling her about her father's kindness, his integrity, the way he made me laugh until my sides ached. I told her about the life we were going to build together, the house with the big front porch, the garden where she could play, the bedtime stories you would read to her. Emmett, you must not blame yourself for what happened. Your father's actions were born from his own fear and prejudice, not from any failing on your part. You loved me completely and honestly, and that love created something beautiful in our daughter. If fate brings you together, please don't let the circumstances of our separation poison the chance for you to be her father. She will need your strength, your wisdom, your protection in ways that Agnes, bless her heart, cannot provide. Love her for both of us. Help her understand that she was born from joy, not tragedy. And please, my darling, find a way to be happy. The greatest honor you could give my memory would be to live the full, loving life we always planned. Even if that life looks different than we imagined, I carry your love with me into whatever comes next. Our daughter will carry it forward into the future. Forever yours, Evelyn P.S. The engagement ring is for Clara when she's ready to believe in love again. Tell her that real love, the kind that created her, is worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth believing in, despite all evidence to the contrary. Emmett finished reading through a haze of tears, his chest tight with grief and gratitude. Evelyn had found a way to reach across 28 years of separation to offer forgiveness and guidance, to give him permission to be Clara's father, despite the impossible circumstances of their reunion. "She forgives us," Clara said softly. "Both of us." "Clara, I need you to know something." Emmett turned to face her fully. "What I felt when I first met you, before we knew the truth, that wasn't real love. It was recognition. Some part of me knew you belonged to me, knew you were connected to Evelyn. My heart was responding to that connection, but I was too confused and grief-stricken to understand what it meant." Clara nodded slowly. "I felt it too, like coming home to a place I'd never been. Can you forgive me for not recognizing you sooner, for letting my confusion hurt us both? Can you forgive me for looking like her, for bringing all this pain back into your life?" They looked at each other across the small space between them. Father and daughter. Two people broken by the same tragedy, but maybe, finally, ready to heal together. "Yes," they said simultaneously, and for the first time since learning the truth, Clara smiled. It was Evelyn's smile, radiant and hopeful, but it was also purely Clara's, the expression of a young woman ready to reclaim her heritage and build a relationship with the father she'd never known she had. They spent the morning at Evelyn's grave, father and daughter sharing stories across the years that had separated them. Clara told Emmett about her childhood with Agnes, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give her a loving home, despite the dangerous secret she carried. She spoke of school plays where she'd scanned the audience hoping to see parents who would never come. Graduation ceremonies where Agnes had cheered loudly enough for 2 people. Quiet moments when she'd wondered about the family she'd never known. Emmett shared memories of Evelyn that Agnes had never been able to provide. He told Clara about her mother's laugh, bright and infectious, the kind that made strangers smile just hearing it. About Evelyn's terrible cooking skills and her habit of reading poetry aloud while doing dishes. About the way she'd volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend, coming home covered in dog hair and radiating joy. She would have been an amazing mother, Emmett said, watching Clara arrange the white roses around the headstone. You have her compassion, her strength. Even in the short time I knew you at the office, I could see those qualities. Agnes used to say I had an old soul, Clara replied. She'd tell me I was wise beyond my years, like I'd inherited knowledge from somewhere else. I think she meant from Mom, as the sun reached its peak. They drove into the small town of Dixon to have lunch at a family-owned diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. Over coffee and apple pie, they began the delicate process of figuring out how to move forward. I need to ask you something, Clara said, stirring sugar into her coffee with nervous energy. What are we going to do about your father? About Silas? Emmett had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was necessary. What do you mean? He's dead, so he can't be prosecuted for what he did to Mom. But the world should know the truth, shouldn't it? The people who thought you were some tragic figure, abandoned by your fiancé, they deserve to know what really happened. Emmett considered this carefully. For 29 years, he'd been the subject of whispered speculation in Nashville's social circles. The tragic young businessman whose bride-to-be had run away on the eve of their wedding. Some people pitied him. Others wondered what dark secret had driven Evelyn away. The truth would vindicate him, but it would also destroy the Blackwood legacy that his father had worked so hard to build. There's something else, Emmett said quietly. Before my father died 10 years ago, he gave me a sealed envelope, told me to open it only if something ever happened to threaten the family reputation. I never opened it. I assumed it was just business documents. Maybe evidence of some corporate maneuvering he wanted to keep quiet. Clara leaned forward. You think it might be about Mom? I think Silas knew that secrets have a way of surfacing eventually. He was too calculating to leave loose ends. Emmett pulled out his phone. We could drive to my house and open it together, if it contains what I think it might. We'll have choices to make about how to handle the truth. The drive back to Nashville was tense with anticipation. Emmett's penthouse felt different with Clara there, less like a mausoleum and more like a home that was finally being visited by family. Clara moved through the space quietly, taking in the expensive art and elegant furniture that spoke of wealth, but little warmth. It's beautiful, she said politely, though Emmett could hear the reservation in her voice. It's empty, he replied honestly. I bought it to escape memories, but all I did was create a different kind of prison. In his study, Emmett retrieved the sealed envelope from his personal safe. Clara sat beside him on the leather sofa as he broke the wax seal that had remained intact for a decade. Inside were several documents, and a letter written in Silas Blackwood's precise handwriting. Emmett, if you are reading this, then circumstances have forced you to confront the truth about Evelyn Marlowe's disappearance. I suppose it's fitting that my own words should be the instrument of my confession. I want you to understand that everything I did was to protect our family's position and secure your future. The Blackwood name carries weight in Tennessee, in the business world, in political circles. A marriage to a girl of Evelyn's background would have diminished that influence considerably. I attempted to reason with her first, offering her a substantial sum to disappear quietly. When she refused, I decided that stronger measures were necessary. I arranged for her to be taken to the old Harrison's farm in Dixon County, intending to hold her there until she came to her senses and agreed to end the engagement. The plan was never to harm her permanently. I thought a few weeks of isolation would convince her that your worlds were too different for the marriage to succeed. But when we discovered she was pregnant, the situation became more complicated. I will not detail the events that followed, except to say that Evelyn Marlowe died during childbirth. On November 15, 1996, the child, a daughter, was taken by one of the staff members who had become too emotionally involved in the situation. I buried Evelyn in the old cemetery behind the Baptist church on Highway 46. I also arranged for certain documentation to be prepared in the event that questions were ever raised about her disappearance. Emmett, I hope you understand that every action I took was motivated by love for you and concern for our family's legacy. If you are reading this, then my efforts have failed, and you must decide how to proceed. The attached documents include a full confession, witness statements from the men I hired, and financial records showing payments made to ensure their silence. Do with this information what your conscience demands. I pray that history will judge me as a father who loved his son, even if my methods were misguided. Silas Blackwood. Clara read the letter twice, her face growing paler with each word. He's confessing to murder and kidnapping, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. Emmett's voice was hollow. He's handed us everything we need to clear the record, but he's also destroying your family's reputation in the process. Emmett looked at the confession in his hands, the key to his vindication and his father's posthumous disgrace. For decades, he'd carried the weight of abandonment, believing that the woman he loved had chosen to leave him. Now he had proof that she'd died calling his name, that she'd never stopped loving him, that her disappearance had been orchestrated by his own father. Clara, I need you to know something. Whatever we decide to do with this confession, it won't bring your mother back or erase the years we lost, but it might help other people understand what really happened. Clara was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the Nashville skyline. What would Mom want us to do? Emmett thought about Evelyn's letters, about her emphasis on forgiveness and moving forward. I think she'd want us to choose the path that honors her memory without destroying our chance for a future together. Then we tell the truth, Clara said firmly. All of it. We make the confession public. We clear your name. And we make sure everyone knows that Evelyn Marlowe was murdered for the crime of loving someone above her social station. Emmett nodded slowly. It will be difficult. There will be media attention, investigations, questions about why I waited so long to reveal the truth. We'll face it together, Clara said, taking his hand. Father and daughter, the way we should have from the beginning. As evening fell over Nashville, they began making plans to contact the authorities and the media. Silas Blackwood's crimes would finally be exposed. Evelyn's memory would be vindicated, and two people who had been torn apart by lies would begin the process of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of truth. The confession that had been hidden for a decade would finally give them the closure they needed to move forward. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly renamed Evelyn Marlowe Foundation headquarters, casting warm light across the bustling office space that had once been the cold corporate floors of Blackwood Industries. Clara stood at the window of what had been Emmett's executive suite, watching volunteers arrive for the day's work with domestic violence survivors. The transformation had been remarkable. Where intimidating marble and steel once dominated, there were now comfortable seating areas, children's play spaces and consultation rooms designed to make traumatized women feel safe and welcome. The building that had once symbolized corporate power now represented hope and healing. The Henderson family arrives at 10, said Maria Santos, the foundation's new director and a former prosecutor who specialized in domestic violence cases. 3 children, ages 4 to 12. Mom's been in hiding for 8 months. Clara nodded, reviewing the case file. This was their 47th family since the foundation opened, and each story reminded her of her mother's courage in impossible circumstances. Security arrangements, complete, new identities processed, safe house ready, and the kids are enrolled in school under their new names. The husband's assets have been frozen pending investigation. Maria smiled. Thanks to your father's legal team, this one should be straightforward. The word father still sent a small thrill through Clara's heart. 6 months ago, she'd been an orphan with only Agnes's fading health for family. Now she had Emmett, a man who'd thrown himself into learning how to be a parent, with the same intensity he'd once applied to building his business empire. Their relationship hadn't been easy. Both carried scars from their initial attraction and the trauma of learning the truth. But with the help of family counselors and their shared commitment to honoring Evelyn's memory, they'd slowly built something beautiful and healthy. Any word from the Louisville office? Clara asked. 3 more families served this week, and the Kentucky legislature is considering our model for statewide implementation. Maria gathered her files. Your mother would be proud of what you've built here. Clara touched the simple silver locket around her neck, Evelyn's locket, which had been in the wooden box along with the engagement ring. Inside was a tiny photo of her parents on their engagement day, young and radiant with love and hope. The media storm following Silas Blackwood's posthumous confession had been brutal but necessary. For weeks, Nashville couldn't stop talking about the shocking revelation that one of the city's most prominent families had covered up a kidnapping and murder for nearly 3 decades. Emmett had endured countless interviews, depositions, and public scrutiny with quiet dignity, always emphasizing that the real story was Evelyn's courage and Agnes's sacrifice. The legal proceedings had been swift, with Silas's detailed confession and supporting documentation. The case was clear-cut. Evelyn Marlowe was officially declared the victim of homicide, and her death certificate was amended to reflect the truth. The men Silas had hired to kidnap her had been arrested, those still alive anyway, and faced federal charges. But perhaps most importantly, Evelyn's body had been moved from the abandoned cemetery to a beautiful plot in Nashville's historic Mount Olivet Cemetery. Her new headstone read, "Evelyn Marlowe Blackwood, beloved mother and fiancée. Her love lives on." The decision to give her Emmett's name had been Clara's idea. She should have been a Blackwood, she'd said. She earned that name through everything she endured. A soft knock interrupted Clara's thoughts. Emmett stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of proud smile that had become familiar over the past months. "How's my daughter this morning?" he asked, offering her one of the cups. "Ready to change some lives," Clara replied. Accepting the coffee gratefully, they'd established this ritual. Morning coffee together before the foundation opened. A few minutes to connect as father and daughter before taking on the world's problems. "The board meeting is at 2, Emmett reminded her. Final approval for the expansion to Memphis. Clara had officially become the foundation's president 3 months ago, when it became clear that her passion for the work and natural leadership abilities made her the obvious choice. Emmett served as chairman of the board, providing financial oversight and strategic guidance, while giving Clara the freedom to shape the organization's mission. "I still can't believe we're expanding so quickly," Clara said. "Your mother always said that love multiplies when it's shared," Emmett replied. The foundation is proof of that. They'd learned to speak of Evelyn naturally now, incorporating her memory into their daily lives without the crushing weight of grief that had initially accompanied any mention of her name. She was part of their family story, not the tragic ending, but the love that had created their relationship and continued to guide their work. At 10 o'clock, the Henderson family arrived. Clara watched from the security monitors as Maria greeted them at the specially designed entrance that couldn't be seen from the street. Mrs. Henderson looked exhausted and frightened, but there was determination in her eyes as she shepherded her children into the safe space the foundation provided. "She looks like Mom," Clara said quietly, noting the woman's protective stance and the way she'd positioned herself between potential danger and her children. "She has your mother's courage," Emmett agreed, "and now she'll have the support Evelyn never got." By afternoon, the Henderson family was settled in their safe house with new identities, counseling appointments scheduled, and legal proceedings initiated against their abuser. It was the kind of comprehensive help that the foundation had become known for, not just temporary shelter, but complete life transformation. The board meeting went smoothly, with unanimous approval for the Memphis expansion. Clara presented her vision for serving rural communities across Tennessee, using mobile units to reach women who couldn't travel to urban centers for help. "We're changing the conversation about domestic violence," she told the board. "Instead of asking why women don't leave, we're asking how we can make it safer for them to escape." After the meeting, Clara and Emmett drove to Mount Olivet Cemetery for their weekly visit to Evelyn's grave. It had become a tradition, sharing the foundation's progress with the woman whose memory inspired their work. The headstone was surrounded by white roses that bloomed year-round thanks to Emmett's arrangement with the groundskeeping staff. Visitors often left flowers too, people who'd been touched by Evelyn's story and wanted to honor her memory. 47 families served, Clara reported to the headstone, settling cross-legged on the grass as she'd done as a child when talking to Agnes about important things. Memphis expansion approved. The Louisville office is training local law enforcement on trauma-informed response protocols. Emmett placed fresh white roses in the vase, then sat beside his daughter, and Clara got accepted to the graduate program at Vanderbilt. She's going to study nonprofit management while running the foundation. This was new information, and Clara looked at him in surprise. "How did you know? I just got the acceptance letter yesterday," Because I may have made a phone call or two on your behalf. Not to influence their decision," he added quickly, "but to make sure they understood the significance of your work." Clara laughed, the same bright, infectious sound that Evelyn's had been. "You're going to spoil me. That's what fathers are for," as the sun began to set over Nashville, painting the cemetery in golden light. Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a lost young woman carrying secrets she didn't understand. Now she was part of a family united by love, leading an organization that was making real change in the world. "Do you think she knows?" Clara asked, looking at her mother's headstone. "About the foundation, about us." Emmett followed her gaze. "I think she's been guiding us all along, the way you found your way to my office, the timing of Agnes's confession, even the fact that we both survived the truth about our relationship. None of that was coincidence." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of her mother's engagement ring on her right hand. She'd started wearing it recently, not as a symbol of lost love, but as a reminder that real love, the kind that created her, was worth fighting for. As they prepared to leave, Clara placed her hand on the headstone one last time. "Thank you, Mom, for everything." The Evelyn Marlowe Foundation would continue growing, helping more families escape violence and rebuild their lives. Father and daughter would continue healing, building the relationship that should have existed from the beginning, and somewhere in the space between memory and hope, Evelyn's love lived on, transforming tragedy into triumph, one saved life at a time.